All right, hello guys, and welcome back. This is part 3 of our first lesson in Unit 9, Civil Rights. We're talking about the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s in this first lesson. So take out your journal, pick up right where we left off yesterday. We were talking about the landmark Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. And remember, that Supreme Court case litigated brilliantly by the future Supreme Court Justice and NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. That case is going to desegregate all of America's schools. It's going to legally say no more segregation in schools in America. However, remember that just because the law changes doesn't mean that people automatically will follow. And many schools in the South will resist. There will be massive waves of white supremacist Southern resistance across the South. And we examined one instance of this resistance with the racist murder of the young man Emmett Till in 1955. Okay, so today we're going to talk about two key instances at the beginning of the civil rights movement in the 50s. The first really big event that's going to kick off the modern civil rights movement is the Montgomery bus boycott. And I'm sure most of you have probably heard some about this. You probably are familiar with Rosa Parks. So let's talk about her. Rosa Parks was in her early 40s. She was actually the secretary of the local Montgomery, Alabama chapter of the NAACP. And Rosa Parks, in her job, she worked tirelessly and everything else. And she had ended up in trouble with the authorities before fighting segregation laws. But there is a common misconception that exists that Rosa Parks refused to leave her seat on that bus that day because she was tired from work or something. That is not the case. Rosa Parks was tired of segregation, and she was tired of the city of Montgomery, Alabama, segregating everything and treating its Black citizens like they were second-class citizens. And that is why she refused to leave her seat. Now, there had earlier been similar instances of Black citizens, including a 15-year-old pregnant teenager who had been arrested for similar events, basically refusing to give up their seat on the city buses because the city bus policy said that white bus riders could sit at the front and Black bus riders had to sit at the back. And typically the middle seats could be filled by whoever, but if there were white bus riders that came on board while the seats were filled, Black bus riders would have to move to the back to make room for those white bus riders to sit in the middle as well. And so there was some ongoing legal cases about whether this policy of bus segregation was okay. And that is in December of 1955. This is, just a few months after the widely publicized murder of Emmett Till, that Rosa Parks is going to take her stand by sitting down. She had run-ins with that same bus driver on that particular bus before. He was definitely a racist. And she was actually not sitting at the front of the bus. She was sitting in an area that she was lawfully allowed under the city ordinances, the city segregation to sit in. Here's the diagram from the case. You could see Rosa Parks. She was sitting in the middle of the bus where Blacks were allowed to sit. This is the whites only at the front, Blacks, at the back, but in the middle, as long as the bus wasn't crowded, Blacks could sit there. And then a new white passenger got on board. And so the bus driver, he told the Blacks in the middle to move back, and Rosa Parks refused. The bus driver said, you're going to cause trouble. And she's like, I'm not getting out of the seat. And so he called the authorities and she got arrested. And this is going to trigger this bus boycott. The Black citizens, the Black churches, the Black leaders of Montgomery, Alabama are going to actually come together and organize a giant boycott. A boycott is where you refuse to partake in something, refuse to buy something in order to protest a policy or protest something that is going on. In this case, the boycott is about the city buses. because they had this segregated policy, the Black citizens of Montgomery, Alabama will refuse to ride the city buses, and they'll refuse to buy the tickets to ride the city buses. And the city is going to be denied all this money, this revenue from these Black bus riders, because they're not going to be riding the buses. Now, if this seems like, well, that's not really that big a deal, or just, I mean, bus tickets aren't that expensive, think about the economics of this. Okay, we've been talking about, like, in the Unit 8 in the 1950s, white flights and the suburbanization occurring across American cities. Remember that many whites had left the city centers by the 1950s and were moving out to those burbs, those suburbs on the edges of the cities or out in the rural parts. And so most of the people who are going to be living in the city, like in Montgomery by 1955, are African American. That means most, like 80% of the people who ride the buses, okay, were African American. Not to mention that if you're a white person living in the city, more than likely you'd have the opportunities and the family wealth to have a car. Most African Americans did not have those opportunities and did not own their own vehicle. And so they were forced to ride the public transportation. So again, 80% of all the bus riders in the city of Montgomery were Black. And you have 80% of your clientele not purchasing tickets, that's going to be a huge, huge loss of revenue. The city wasn't making that buck, in other words. And that's ultimately, you know, how you get change to happen. It's not always pretty, but, you know, you attack them in their wallet. You attack them where it hurts, politically or economically. And this is the power of this boycott. You know, it's a form of non-violent protest. They're not killing anybody. They're not hurting anybody. They're just refusing to buy these bus tickets to make their points. Like, hey, you want our money, treat us better. And it was very effective. It did require massive organizing, okay? Because you're talking about, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of people who relied on the buses to get around, being told by the Black leaders, Black churches and everything, don't ride the bus. So they had to find alternative methods. And this is where you'd had, you know, this is grassroots. This is the people themselves, the African Americans of Montgomery, you know, doing this themselves. But they found ways to get around riding the bus. They did carpools where, you know, people would all ride together in the same car to get to work and to get home from work and stuff, or to get to the grocery store. Many African Americans, they rode bikes, or they would just simply walk to work. But they found ways to avoid having to ride the bus, to hurt the city's economy. And eventually the city will relent. Eventually the city, through the combination of the boycott and the ongoing court cases, the city will finally desegregate its bus policy. It will end the segregated busing policy. And so this Montgomery bus boycott was a giant success, and it got publicity nationwide as well, showing the benefits and how successful nonviolent civil disobedience, this form of like protest such as a boycott, could be. And one of the early leaders that's going to emerge from the Montgomery bus boycott, from the organizing to make it work, was this very young, he was just in his mid-20s, pastor from the nearby state of Georgia. He was a church leader in Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, his name was Martin Luther King Jr. And so MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., he came to Alabama to assist in this bus boycott. And through his amazing oratory skills, the speeches he gave at many of the churches, the help and his skill at getting people to carpool and find alternative ways to avoid riding the bus, he kind of emerges as the leader of this boycott that's going to prove so successful. And he kind of becomes the face early on of this nonviolent civil rights movement. Okay, and when we say nonviolent, we mean that Dr. King's methods are going to be, you know, breaking the laws, the segregation, Jim Crow laws, because the laws were bad. So that's civil disobedience, when you break the laws, but you're not hurting anybody. You're breaking the laws to show that the laws themselves are corrupt, are bad. And you can use nonviolent protest in many different forms. You can, you know, give speeches to give protest, hold a march to raise awareness. You can do a boycott like they did here and refuse to buy something to hurt them economically. You can do a sit-in where you go to a place that has a bad policy, like a segregated restaurant that doesn't allow blacks to sit at the front lunch counters and stuff. And you can sit in those seats and refuse to leave until you are served. That's a sit-in. So you can do all these different sorts of nonviolent protest. And Dr. King will emerge as kind of the leader of this nonviolent civil rights movement. Okay. By the way, the governor of Alabama, his name, you might want to write down in your notes because we're going to talk about him a little bit later, was George Wallace. And George Wallace, like many Southern governors and Southern white politicians at this time, was part of that massive resistance where George Wallace was extremely racist and refused for the longest time to agree to desegregate the buses. So he stood in the way of some of the civil rights. All right, now the last thing we're going to talk about in lesson 1 is in 1957, this has to do with school desegregation. Okay, so remember that Brown versus Board of Education, that's going to desegregate by law all of America's schools in 1954. So after 1954, all the schools in America were supposed to be desegregated. Black and white kids, Hispanic kids, all kids of all colors were supposed to be able to go to the same schools. But just because the law changed doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen. You need enforcement in order to make changes happen. That's like the job of the executive branch, to enforce the law, right? And so that enforcement was not there. And you're not actually going to see most schools desegregate until like the 1960s or 70s. So this case in Little Rock, Arkansas, at the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, is going to be one of the first big battlegrounds to test the enforcement on Brown versus Board to see if, hey, can we actually get Black kids to be able to go into a white school safely? Can we actually make this work now that the law has changed? So that's the Little Rock 9. And it was called the Little Rock 9 because there's going to be 9 African-American students chosen from kind of the Little Rock, Arkansas area, the local Black schools. They'll be chosen for their grades, they'll be chosen for their attendance, but most of all, they were chosen because they were brave enough to volunteer to make this work. So these are some 9 very courageous African-American students. And they're chosen to integrate, to go into this all-white high school. So these 9 Black students are going to go into this all-white school. And initially on the first day of class, they show up and they are met with the actual National Guard, the actual state guard of the state of Arkansas was sent by the governor of Arkansas. His name was Orville Faubus. He's, again, like George Wallace, a very racist, white supremacist, staunch segregationist. He's going to refuse to allow them in. And they're going to be turned away. They're not going to even be allowed to enter the school. And there were crowds and crowds from all these white Little Rock citizens that had turned out to basically jeer at these students, to call them names and threaten them and basically say, turn around, we don't want you, get out of here. And so they were not allowed to go into the school just because they were Black, even though legally the Supreme Court had said that it was their right to go into this school. So the NAACP, and again, Thurgood Marshall was involved here, the NAACP is once again going to get involved, and they're going to say legally this is not okay. There needs to be enforcement to allow these 9 African-American students to enter the school. Orville Faubus, the governor, was interfering with a national law. Okay, the Supreme Court decides the laws for the entire country. The governor of a state can't go against that. And so the president's going to have to get involved. And so President Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, remember him, our former World War II, D-Day general, he's president at the time. He didn't especially really want to get involved, but he kind of is forced to, because this is an issue of a state trying to undermine the national authority of the United States. It's like some civil rights or some Civil War stuff right there. And so Eisenhower will send in the troops. In fact, he's going to send in some of our very best. He's going to send in the 101st, the Screaming Eagles. That's the very same unit that had paratrooped in behind enemy lines the night before D-Day and had gone all the way through Germany and the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Bastogne and all of that. This very fabled, famous group of American soldiers, that's not the same exact soldiers from World War II, but the same unit, the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne, is going to be sent in by Eisenhower to directly escort these 9 African-American high school students into this all-white school. Like, can you imagine that? That's crazy to think about, and you don't have to think about it because I actually have the book for this. Let me put a pause on this. I'm going to show you guys that. So the book I always assign to my college kids every year, it's one of the books we assign, is called Warriors Don't Cry. And it's by one of the 9 students that was part of this Little Rock 9. Her name is Melba Patillo Beals. And she was just, I think, 15 or 16 years old when her school year started at Little Rock at Central High School. And she details her whole experience in this book. And I'm offering it for extra credit for you guys for the 5th 6 weeks. So if you can get this book read before the end of the 5th 6 weeks, email me and I'll send you some questions and you answer that and you'll get extra credit. And if you don't want to purchase this book, I do have some extra copies available in my classroom. So please feel free to stop by the school anytime and you can pick up a copy. I just ask that you return my book if you borrow one before the end of the school year. So that's an option for you for extra credit. And it's a wonderful true story about the Little Rock 9, told from the perspective of one of these 9 African-American students. And the stuff that these students had to go through, it's amazing to think about. Like they were facing, their white classmates who would try to trip them in the hallways, who would shove them, who would physically intimidate them. Melba talks about how just going to the restroom at school was so dangerous that she would get jumped oftentimes and attacked in the restroom by white students just for trying to, be a Black student going to their school. And then there's also some stories about some white students that tried to befriend them, that tried to help them out. And it's a story of humanity and about being a high schooler in the 1950s, and a story about civil rights and about integration. But these 9 students faced enormous adversity going through their year at Central High School. And they had literally the 101st Airborne, you can see this picture here, these United States Army soldiers escorting them to the school. And they would have, each one of the 9 Black students would have a designated soldier that would follow them around the school. They weren't allowed to go in the bathroom with them. They weren't allowed to actually literally go in the classroom with them, but they had a soldier escort that was basically trying to keep them safe. But the soldiers couldn't interfere with bullying. And white students that would jeer at them or bully them, call them names or try to trip them, little things like that, the soldiers were not allowed to interfere with. The soldiers were only there under orders to make sure that they weren't killed. And there was an instance where some chemicals were thrown at Melba and some of the others. There was a fire that was started in the bathroom. It was some crazy stuff that year. Minnie Jean, one of the 9, she actually got expelled because during lunchtime in the cafeteria, some of the white students were kind of starting to attack her and tripping her. And so she threw her chili bowl over the face of one, basically, here's some chili on your face. And because of starting that food fight, she literally got expelled. The white students, of course, suffered no consequences. And so this is the story of the Little Rock 9, and just shows you how difficult it was for Black students to try to integrate into these all-white schools, that just because you had the law change due to the Supreme Court's decision in the Brown versus Board of Education case, that you weren't having enforcement. You weren't having schools actually desegregate. And here's the thing. Schools, like I said, will not actually begin to desegregate in a big way. You won't have, most schools desegregate until the 60s and 70s. And the reason for that is because that's when finally You're going to get things like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act under the Great Society, under like Lyndon Johnson in the late 1960s. That law will put the government's money where its mouth was. So the government's mouth in 1954 said that schools need to desegregate, but they weren't offering any enforcement. The ESEA under Johnson in the 60s will force schools to desegregate because it withheld money. It withheld the funds from schools if they refused to follow the federal orders, okay? So your school couldn't get any money unless they started to allow Black kids to enter it. And that's finally, of course, because of the money, that's finally when most schools began to really desegregate. And you're also going to have school busing begin, I believe, in the 1970s. And that is going to be really, really actually kind of a good thing for getting Blacks and whites into schools with each other to really begin to make integration happen. You'd have to move these kids over to these schools because they didn't live in the same areas. And when school busing ended, that's when a lot of our renewed segregation in schools that we see today really began. And, you know, the last 30 years, schools have become more and more segregated, not by law, but by socioeconomic circumstances and systemic racism. All right. So Little Rock 9, how does this end? The 9 African-American students, they survived the school year. One of them, I think Jefferson Thomas was his name. I'm sorry, I can't remember his specific name. I think he was a senior that year and he actually managed to graduate. The others were like sophomores and juniors and stuff. But at the end of the school year, the governor of Arkansas, once again, Orville Faubus, he actually closes down Central High School rather than allow the Black students to return a second year. And so just again, showing you the enormous odds that were stacked against Black students in this integration process. It's going to be a slow, hard-fought process. And then finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, it's going to create a commission to look into how Blacks were being denied the right to vote through like the literacy test and the poll taxes. That means it wasn't going to actually do a whole lot, and it had no enforcement. It did, like I said, create the Civil Rights Division that was supposed to look into enforcing anti-discrimination, to, you know, ending discrimination. It's not going to do a whole lot. And one of the reasons it wasn't able to do a whole lot, this Civil Rights Act in 1957 under Eisenhower, was because it didn't have a lot of strong support from the president, A, and B, and there you can see Eisenhower next to MLK right there. The other reason is that you had many Southern Democrats, these were called Dixiecrats at the time, guys like Strom Thurmond, this Southern Democratic senator, who refused to go along with this, and they actually filibustered. Strom Thurmond did a Senate filibuster where you stand up in front of the Senate chamber and you talk, and as long as you are talking, they can't pass a law. And so Strom Thurmond, he did a filibuster and held up this civil rights law that wasn't even that good. It didn't even do that much. He was so racist that he didn't even want anything happening civil rights. So he talked for over 24 hours straight, not taking any breaks, about how awful and how terrible this civil rights law was. And again, it shows you there's massive resistance against change, that there's deeply entrenched, you know, racist individuals and ideas in America that's really hard to get changed. And that's what the civil rights movement was all about, trying to get some of that change to finally happen. So next time in lesson 2, we're going to talk about some of the ways that the civil rights movement is going to grow and progress and evolve in its civil discourse, its civil disobedience, and the nonviolent civil rights movement. Thank you guys so much for joining, and I will talk to you later, assuming that this will end.